Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to speak to this motion that this House support action to address the unacceptable situation of more than 70 homeless camps in the Lower Mainland and throughout British Columbia. Honourable Speaker, I got involved in politics in 2007, 6 years after the BC Liberals came to power, and I got involved because the homeless situation in the Tri-Cities had ballooned, and a local church in my community had decided that enough was enough. They wanted to host a cold, wet weather mat program and needed to get the city's permission to do so. I got involved, Honourable Speaker, because I thought it was a fabulous idea, and I wanted to make sure that Council of the Day knew that there was community support. It was my first ever appearance before Council, and little did I know that stepping up to lend my voice, my small voice to this small action in my community would first take me to Coquitlam Council as a city councillor, and then here in this chamber as the voice of citizens living in Coquitlam-Millardville. What I didn't know at the time, Honourable Speaker, was just how much this homeless situation would continue to grow in spite of our small local efforts. We managed to eventually squeeze some resources from this government to actually build a shelter in their community that opened last December. And the shelter had been at capacity since the day it opened because there was nothing else that existed in the community. Now, part of the reason that there's no capacity is that there's nowhere else for the people who are at the shelter to go, Honourable Speaker, because there's nothing affordable for them to rent. There's no affordable housing in my community that people can move on to, because this government continues to bury its head in the sand, pretending that there's no housing or homeless crisis. The fact that this government actually refuses to do a proper provincial homeless count tells British Columbians that they don't even want to know the scope of the problem. And they don't want to know the scope of the problem because they have been ignoring the problem. The fact that this Premier and her housing minister have instructed homeless shelters to stop counting those who are turned away from shelters is the most telling evidence that they are just not interested in understanding what's really going on in British Columbia around housing, Honourable Speaker. Because if we don't count them, then we can pretend that they just don't exist. But British Columbians know that those living in our streets, on our park benches, tents in our parks and along our rivers, they know that the problem exists, Honourable Speaker, and they know that this BC Liberal government is content to just ignore the problem. Now, the Minister of Housing likes to brag about all the new units of housing that he has created, and we just heard it from the members opposite. What he doesn't tell you, Honourable Speaker, is that they count the new shelter spaces as new units of housing. Well, Minister, a mat on the floor is not housing. That's not housing for them, it's not housing for me, it's not housing for anybody in this chamber. It is not housing. It is simply a mat on a floor. For years, housing advocates like the BC Nonprofit Housing Association has been calling for at least 3,000 units of affordable housing every year, and this government has just refused to listen. And now we have a crisis on our hands. The truth is, Honourable Speaker, this government just doesn't care about those who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. Right after the last election, the Minister of Housing declared, and I quote, "We don't build social housing anymore." It would appear that this government prefers to have people build tent cities instead. Honourable Speaker, there are more than 15,000 people on the waitlist for supportive housing in British Columbia. 15,000 people. Rents in the Lower Mainland are through the roof. The BC Nonprofit Housing Association, in partnership with Van City, developed the Rental Housing Index. And of the 98 communities reviewed for this index, Coquitlam is the second worst performer in the province when it comes to rental housing. This explains, Honourable Speaker, why 17 people who had temporary shelter on a mat during an extreme weather event last week turned up at my colleague's office in Port Coquitlam, protesting that they had to leave the shelter because the weather warmed up a bit. Well, that's a policy of BC Housing. That's a policy of this government. How is it that this government thinks it's okay to tell people, it's a few degrees warmer, time for you to move on? How is it okay that women leaving abusive relationships can't find affordable housing so they're left sleeping in their car? How is it okay that SH, a 19-year-old who aged out of care, died alone in a tent city because there was no one to ensure that she had housing? How is it okay, Honourable Speaker, that there currently are 56 children homeless in Kamloops? This is outrageous, Honourable Speaker, and my expectation is that this government will take action today. Thank you.